This story is titled, Mom and Dad Forced Me to Be Independent and Pay for My Studies While Golden Sister Got Everything. Now, they're begging for my return after family crisis. Hey everyone, I'm Maya, 23 years old and recently graduated from college. But my story starts way earlier, and I need to take you back to where it all began when I was 18. That's when my parents pulled the most ridiculous stunt ever. Something that would fundamentally change our relationship and set me on a completely different path than I had imagined. It was the summer after high school, and I was super excited about starting community college in the fall. I had specifically picked a school close to home in Sacramento because, let's be real, college costs are absolutely insane these days. I had some savings from my part-time job at a local coffee shop and thought I could count on at least some support from my parents. It seemed like a solid plan at the time. Work part-time, live at home to save on housing costs, and get my degree without drowning in debt. One evening, my parents called me to the kitchen table. I thought it would be one of those typical proud parent moments where they'd tell me how excited they were about my college journey, or maybe even surprise me with some financial help for textbooks. Boy, was I wrong. Instead, I got hit with the classic, "You're an adult now" speech. You know the one. "It's time to be independent," they said. "You need to learn the value of money," they insisted. And then my mom dropped the bomb that made my stomach literally drop to the floor. "We won't be paying for your college," she announced coldly. "You'll need to figure it out on your own." I was stunned. I hadn't expected them to pay for everything. I'm not entitled, and I understand college is expensive, but not a single penny? No help with tuition? No help with books? Not even gas money for commuting? It felt like a punch to the gut, completely unexpected and painful. But wait, it gets better. My dad, who usually keeps quiet during these kinds of discussions, decided to speak up this time. "If you want to live here, you'll need to start paying rent," he declared. "And your own groceries. It's only fair." Fair? I was still in my childhood bedroom with my middle school posters on the walls, and they wanted rent from me? How was that remotely fair? For context, my parents aren't poor by any stretch of the imagination. My mom's an HR director, and my dad's a construction manager. They're doing just fine financially. They weren't asking for rent because they needed the money. They were doing it to teach me responsibility, as if working through high school while maintaining good grades hadn't already demonstrated that. Meanwhile, my younger sister Nina, who was 17 at the time, was living like actual royalty. She's always been the golden child. Straight A's, captain of the volleyball team, everyone's favorite. My parents basically worship the ground she walks on. The contrast in how we were treated couldn't have been more stark or painful. I wish I could say I stood up to them right there, that I called out their obvious favoritism and unfair treatment. But I didn't. I didn't want to cause drama or seem ungrateful for the roof over my head. So I just sat there like an idiot thinking, fine, I'll pay rent. I'll hustle through college somehow. I've always been independent anyway. But deep down, I was absolutely furious. This wasn't about teaching me responsibility. It was about treating me differently than my sister. And I knew it. Rent wasn't the only thing I had to worry about. I had to figure out how to pay for tuition, books, gas money, groceries. Everything just kept adding up faster than I could count. I started picking up extra shifts at the coffee shop, sometimes working until midnight, and took on side gigs baking stuff, mostly cupcakes and cookies for local events. I was basically working 24/7, but no matter how much I made, it was never enough. Still, I kept pushing forward because I had to be ready when classes started. I thought about moving out more times than I can count. I started looking at apartments near campus, but the rent in Sacramento is absolute insanity. Like, how do people even survive here? Every place I looked at was completely out of my budget, even with potential roommates. I realized pretty quickly that moving out wasn't happening, at least not yet. So I made a deal with myself. I would stick it out at home until graduation, keep my head down, and save every penny I could. The second I had enough money, I would cut them off completely. That became my motivation through every late night shift, every dollar saved, every time I had to skip hanging out with friends. It was all part of my escape plan. I promised myself I was never looking back once I got out. But staying wasn't easy. My parents made everything worse. They started asking for rent before I even started classes, and would constantly remind me about rent being due, even if I was just a day or two away from paying. I was never even late with my payments. They just loved holding it over my head. Meanwhile, they were showering Nina with gifts like every week was Christmas. One time they took her shopping for new volleyball gear and ended up buying her an entire wardrobe. She came home with bags full of clothes, new shoes, all kinds of accessories, grinning like she had won the lottery. When I asked Mom if they could help with my textbook since the semester was starting soon, she just looked at me and said, "Maya, you need to learn to budget better. Nina doesn't have these kinds of expenses." That hit different. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how little they cared about what I was going through while giving Nina everything she wanted. Nina didn't make things any better. She's not evil or anything, just incredibly spoiled. She would constantly brag about all her new stuff and complain about how hard volleyball practice was while I was running on 3 hours of sleep, trying to juggle work and saving for school. One night, I came home after working a double shift, completely dead tired, and found her lounging on the couch playing with her new AirPods Max. "Mom and Dad got these for me," she said like it was no big deal. "You should get some too, they're amazing." I just looked at her, exhaustion and frustration bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, maybe when I don't have to pay rent," I replied dryly. She rolled her eyes and went back to watching TikTok, completely oblivious to the irony of her suggestion. There were so many moments where I wanted to scream, to tell my parents how fucked up this all was, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. They had their golden child, and I was just the one paying rent. So I kept my mouth shut and focused on my plan to get out as soon as possible. College was supposed to be this amazing new chapter in my life, but instead it felt like pure survival mode from day one. I thought I'd have time to find my rhythm, maybe even enjoy myself a little, but that wasn't happening. Between classes, work, and my parents breathing down my neck about rent, I was running on empty 24/7s. My typical day started at 5:30 a.m. I'd be out the door by 6:30 at community college for morning classes and trying to study between lectures. By noon, I had to rush to my shift at the coffee shop, where I'd most days work until 9 or 10 p.m. Then I'd go home and pass out, only to do it all over again the next day. Weekends? What weekends? That's when I'd be baking for side gigs because, surprise, part-time work wasn't cutting it. I'd love to say I was handling it like a boss, but that would be a lie. The coffee shop was absolute chaos, always understaffed, and COVID made everyone extra pissy. Every shift felt like running a marathon. I'd be behind the counter making lattes, then sprinting to drive-thru, then dealing with Karen number 156 who thinks her mocha isn't hot enough. All while knowing I still had a mountain of assignments waiting for me at home. My parents made everything worse. They'd see me dragging myself home late at night, clearly exhausted, but instead of showing any concern, they'd say things like, "Don't forget rent's due Friday," or "We noticed the electricity bill went up." "Are you leaving your lights on too much?" I wanted to scream every single time they opened their mouths with another complaint or reminder. Meanwhile, Nina was living her best life with zero responsibilities. She had no job and all the time in the world for volleyball, hanging with friends, and scrolling through TikTok for hours. I'd come home exhausted and find her on the couch, surrounded by expensive snacks, watching whatever new show she was into, while Mom made her protein smoothies to keep her energy up for practice. It was like we were living in two completely different universes under the same roof. The financial stress was getting ridiculous. The rent they charged wasn't crazy high compared to market rates, but paying to live in my childhood home? That felt like a slap in the face. When you add in all the other costs, I was constantly broke. Some weeks I would open my banking app, stare at the balance, and wonder how to stretch $37 until my next paycheck. Asking for help? Forget about it. One time I asked my mom if she could cover groceries for a week because I had to buy a $180 biology textbook. She gave me this look like I'd asked her to buy me a car. "Maya, we're already doing so much by letting you stay here," she said condescendingly. Letting me stay here? Like I wasn't paying rent? Like I wasn't contributing more than Nina, who still got her weekly allowance without lifting a finger? Things hit rock bottom during midterms. I was drowning in assignments, barely sleeping, and to make matters worse, my hours at the coffee shop got cut because business was slow. I was trying to make up the lost income with extra baking, but there are only so many hours in a day. I got this huge order one weekend, 125 cupcakes and a custom cake for a birthday party. It was great money, but it meant pulling an all-nighter. I spent hours baking, more hours frosting, and even more hours decorating. I finished just in time to deliver them, then went straight to class. By the time I got home that afternoon, I was basically a zombie. I walked into the kitchen and found Mom and Nina baking cookies just for fun. Nina looked up at me and had the audacity to say, "Hey Maya, you should join us. It's so relaxing." I wanted to throw the entire tray of cookies out the window. Instead, I just mumbled something about being tired and went to my room. I didn't wake up until the next morning. By the end of the semester, I was completely burnt out. My grades weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. I was barely keeping my head above water. Every time I thought about how hard I was working just to barely survive, I felt this deep, burning anger. It wasn't fair. I was doing everything they wanted, standing on my own 2 feet, and they couldn't even acknowledge it. Meanwhile, Nina was getting everything handed to her on a silver freaking platter. I don't know how I made it through that first year. It felt like running uphill with a backpack full of bricks, but I kept reminding myself it wouldn't be forever. I just had to survive. What I didn't realize then was that things weren't just unfair. They were completely rigged against me. When I finally found out the truth, it hit me like a freight train. By the time Nina hit senior year of high school, my parents were running a full propaganda campaign to crown her the family's golden child of the century. I always knew they favored her, but this was next-level insanity. They treated Nina's college plans like some national security mission, taking her on campus tours months in advance and turning them into mini family vacations. Every time they came back, Nina had a new haul of university merch, hoodies, water bottles, fancy planners, like she'd won some cosmic lottery. Meanwhile, I was just trying to survive. My budget was so tight that I was constantly behind on something. Tuition payments, books, car maintenance, you name it. I couldn't afford to take as many classes as I wanted, which meant my graduation timeline kept stretching longer. At the rate I was going, I would be lucky to graduate before Nina. One night, my mom came into the kitchen while I was trying to study. I was already on edge because I had forgotten to submit an online assignment, and without even asking how I was doing, she dropped a bomb. "We're thinking of getting Nina a car for college," she said casually. I stared at her, trying to process this bullshit. "She's going to need something reliable," Mom continued, like it was the most logical thing ever. "You know how hard it is to get around without a car." I almost laughed. They wouldn't even help with a bus pass when I started college, and now they were buying Nina a whole car? Mom gave me that look. You know the one. The don't be dramatic look. "Maya, you've always been more independent," she said. "Nina needs more support to succeed." I didn't say anything. I just went back to my notes, pretending I wasn't boiling inside. But here's the thing. It wasn't just the car. That was just the cherry on top. My parents made it clear they were going all in on Nina's college experience. Tuition covered, rent paid, monthly allowance. These were the same parents who told me I needed to learn the value of money. Yet they were basically handing Nina a blank check. It was like watching someone live out your dream right in front of you. The favoritism didn't stop there. My mom spent hours researching dorm decor with Nina, buying matching bedding sets and color-coordinated storage bins. My dad suddenly became a tech expert, helping her pick out the perfect laptop. They even made a college prep budget, which honestly looked more like a shopping list for a spoiled teenager. I'll never forget the night they were all in the living room, huddled around the coffee table with campus brochures spread everywhere. Nina was showing off her Pinterest board of dorm ideas, while Dad was taking notes like he was planning a corporate merger. "What's going on?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We're helping Nina decide between schools," Mom said, barely looking up. "It's such a big decision. We want to make sure she's prepared." Prepared? Right. When she started getting acceptance letters, my parents acted like they'd won the Nobel Prize. She got into her top choice, and they threw a huge celebration dinner, complete with her favorite sushi and a cake saying, "Congrats, Nina," in gold frosting. I didn't even get a good job text when I got into community college. During dinner, Mom kept going on about how proud she was, how Nina had worked so hard for this. At one point, she turned to me and said, "Maya, you must be so proud of your sister. She's really going places." I wanted to scream. Worked hard? Nina barely knew the meaning of hard work. She'd been coasting through life on talent and parental favoritism, while I was drowning in student loans and espresso shots. After that, I started avoiding family dinners completely. It was easier to focus on my own life than watch them build Nina's pedestal higher. The final straw came a few weeks before Nina's move-in day. I came home from work one night and found a shiny used Tesla Model 3 in the driveway. My first thought was maybe the neighbors got a new car, but then Nina came running outside, actually jumping up and down. "They got me a car!" she squealed. I just stood there staring, completely dumbfounded. Later that night, I overheard my mom and dad talking about Nina's monthly allowance, planning to give her enough for groceries, gas money, and extra for fun. Meanwhile, I was eating instant ramen and PB&J because I couldn't afford anything else. I thought about saying something, about calling them out. But what was the point? They'd just say the same thing they always did. Nina needs more support, or it's not about favoritism. So I kept my mouth shut. Nina, being Nina, was completely oblivious. She would pop into my room to show me pictures of her dorm setup and talk about how excited she was for her college journey. One time, she actually said, "Maya, you're so lucky you got to figure out independence early. I don't know if I could handle everything you do." Lucky. She thought I was lucky. I wanted to laugh in her face, but I just said, "Yeah, it's been great," and went back to my homework. The favoritism wasn't bearable anymore. It was so in your face that I started questioning if my parents even saw me as their kid, or just some tenant who happened to share their DNA. I didn't talk to anyone about how I was feeling for the longest time. What was the point? My friends were supportive, but they didn't really get it. Bringing it up at home was like shouting into a void. But one night, I found myself calling Grandpa Marcus. Growing up, I spent hours in his bakery, learning everything from him. How to measure flour properly, how to crack eggs without getting shells everywhere, how to make perfect frosting swirls on cupcakes. It was his way of showing me that hard work could be something you love. He never judged me, never pressured me to be perfect. He just let me be me. I hadn't talked to Grandpa Marcus in a while. He and Grandma had been living their best life since he retired a few years ago. The man spent his whole life building a bakery business from scratch. When he finally decided to step away, he left it with one of his longtime managers so he and Grandma could travel the world. They'd always dreamed about it, and once he hung up his apron, they went for it. The downside was that Grandpa wasn't exactly tech-savvy. He barely knew how to use his phone, let alone handle social media. Staying in touch wasn't easy. He'd send an occasional postcard or call once in a blue moon. Most times, I just heard about their adventures through my parents. They'd only been back for a little while when I called. I guess they decided to slow down and spend more time at home. I hadn't reached out earlier because, honestly, I didn't want to dump my problems on him. He was retired, happy, finally getting to enjoy his life. The last thing I wanted was to ruin that by unloading all my drama. But that night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. When he picked up, I could feel my shoulders relax. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "What's going on?" I didn't hold back. I told him everything. How I was drowning in bills, how my parents were pouring money into Nina's college while making me pay rent. I ranted about the Tesla they bought her, the monthly allowance they planned, how I was left struggling to keep up with school. Grandpa listened quietly, letting me get it all out. I could hear him making small noises, like he was putting a puzzle together. Then, out of nowhere, he interrupted me. "Maya," he said slowly, "didn't your parents use the money I gave them for your education?" I blinked in confusion. "What money?" There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It wasn't angry yet, but there was something sharp about it, like he was trying to stay calm. "When you were 16, he began deliberately, "your grandmother and I put aside $55,000 for your college fund. We gave it to your parents because they said they'd use it for your tuition and expenses." He paused, and I could hear his breathing change. "Are you telling me they never mentioned this to you?" I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "They never said anything," I whispered. "I've been paying for everything myself. All of it." Grandpa let out a heavy sigh, the kind that carried years of disappointment. "Maya, that money was for you. We gave it to them to make sure you had a solid start, so you wouldn't have to struggle. If I'd known this is what they were doing." He trailed off, and I could hear anger creeping into his voice. It took me a minute to process what he was saying. All this time, I'd been told my parents couldn't afford to help me, that they wanted me to learn independence the hard way. But now I was finding out they had $55,000 specifically meant for me, and they hadn't even bothered to tell me about it. "They lied to me," I said, the realization washing over me. "They lied to me," Grandpa said finally, "and they lied to you. That money was yours, not theirs, not Nina's, yours." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to cry, but mostly I just felt numb. The past few years of scraping by, working myself to the bone, falling behind in school, all of it suddenly felt so much heavier. "What do you think they did with it?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Grandpa said, and for the first time I could hear real anger in his voice. "But I'm going to find out." There was a long pause. Then he added, "Maya, you're not alone in this. I'll handle it. You just focus on school, okay?" Hearing him say that made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. For years, I'd been carrying everything alone, thinking no one cared or even noticed. But now, for the first time, I felt like someone was in my corner. "Thanks, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anytime, kiddo," he said. "And Maya, don't let this crush you. You're stronger than they give you credit for." After we hung up, the anger started creeping in, replacing the numbness. How could my parents do this to me? How could they take something meant to make my life easier and keep it from me, knowing full well how much I was struggling? It wasn't just about the money. It was the fact they'd chosen to let me suffer while putting Nina on a pedestal. They'd lied to Grandpa, stolen from me, and then had the audacity to act like I should be grateful for the scraps they gave me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to all the times I'd asked for help. Just a little, just enough to get by, and they brushed me off. Times my mom told me I needed to budget better while they were buying Nina a new phone or booking another campus visit. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, working late nights, skipping meals, delaying graduation, because I didn't think there was any other option. And the whole time, they had $55,000 sitting in their pocket that could have changed everything. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. But there was also part of me that felt something else. Hope. Grandpa Marcus wasn't a person to make empty promises. If he said he was going to handle it, I believed him. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this mess. That thought didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me something to hold on to. A few days after my first conversation with Grandpa, my phone lit up with his name. "I talked to your parents," he said, not even bothering with hello. "Maya, you're not going to believe the excuses they gave me." I braced myself. "What did they say?" "They told me they used the $55,000 your grandmother and I gave them for family expenses." His voice was sharp. When I pressed them on what exactly that meant, your mother admitted they'd been saving it for Nina's college instead. I felt my stomach drop. $55,000. That was more than enough to cover my tuition, rent, and every expense I'd been killing myself to pay for years. And they'd taken it all of it, to make sure Nina had a perfect, stress-free college experience. "They had no right," Grandpa continued, practically seething. "That money was for you. I made it clear they need to repay it, every last cent. And if they don't, they're out of the will." "I can't stay here anymore, Grandpa," I said suddenly. "I can't look at them knowing what they did." "Then don't," he said immediately. "There's a guest room here with your name on it. Pack your things and come over tonight." Moving out of my parents' house was the easiest decision I ever made. I didn't even bother telling them I was leaving. I just started packing my bags as soon as I hung up with Grandpa. Nina walked past my room and raised an eyebrow when she saw the mess. "What's going on?" she asked, completely oblivious to everything that had been happening. "I'm moving out," I said shortly, throwing another pile of clothes into my suitcase. She blinked in surprise. "Wait, what? Why?" "Ask Mom and Dad," I replied, zipping up my suitcase. I didn't owe her an explanation, especially since she'd been benefiting from my stolen money without even knowing it. I didn't see my parents that night. They were both out. I left a short note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "I'm moving in with Grandpa Marcus. Don't call me." And then I was gone. When I got to Grandpa's house, he was waiting at the door. "Come on in, kiddo," he said, pulling me into a hug. "This is where you belong." The guest room was cozy with a big bed and a window overlooking Grandpa's garden. It already felt more like home than my parents' house ever had. That night, for the first time in years, I went to bed without feeling like the weight of the world was crushing me. But of course, peace didn't last long. The next morning, the calls started. Mom was first. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail so dramatic it almost made me laugh. "Maya, how could you just leave like this?" she wailed. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look? You're overreacting. Come home so we can talk this out." "Yeah, no thanks." Then Dad called. He was a little less theatrical, but still just as frustrating. "Maya, we know you're upset," he said in his message. "But this isn't the way to handle things. We're family. We can work through this together." Sure, now they wanted to work through things. Where was that energy when I was drowning in bills and begging for help? By the end of the day, I had ignored a dozen calls and texts from both of them. Their messages were an emotional roller coaster. One minute they were apologizing, the next they were blaming me for turning Grandpa against them. One text from Mom stood out. "Maya, you don't understand how hard this has been for us. We were just trying to do what was best for everyone. Can't you see that? I stared at it for a long time before finally replying. No, Mom, you weren't trying to do what was best for everyone. You were doing what was best for Nina, and you didn't care who you hurt in the process. Her response came instantly. That's not fair. We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought you could handle it because you've always been so strong. There it was again, that same tired excuse. I didn't even bother replying. The next day, they started showing up at Grandpa's house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, helping him sort through some bakery paperwork, when I saw Mom's BMW pull into the driveway. I groaned. They're here, I said, dreading the confrontation. Grandpa didn't look surprised. Let me handle this, he said, standing up and heading to the door. I stayed in the kitchen, but I could hear everything. Mom was already in full meltdown mode when Grandpa opened the door. Marcus, we need to talk to Maya, she said. She's being completely unreasonable about this whole situation. Grandpa didn't let her in. You mean the situation where you stole $55,000 from her? He asked pointedly. I think she's being perfectly reasonable. Mom sputtered, trying to defend herself. We didn't steal it. It was for family. We thought... You thought wrong, Grandpa interrupted. That money was for Maya and you knew it. You made her struggle while you pampered Nina. You don't get to waltz in here and act like the victim. Mom tried again. But Marcus, we were just trying to... Grandpa cut her off again. If you're not here to apologize, you can leave. Maya deserves better than this, and I'm not going to stand by while you try to guilt her into forgiving you. There was a long silence, and then I heard the sound of Mom's car door slamming. She didn't even make it into the house. Once Grandpa demanded they repay the $55,000 they'd stolen from me, my parents' entire operation fell apart. They'd been coasting along like nothing was wrong, but Grandpa wasn't playing around. He gave them a deadline, and when they realized he wasn't bluffing, the panic must have set in. He made it clear they needed to pay back every cent or they'd lose their place in his will. The fallout hit Nina almost immediately. My parents had been cushioning Nina's transition to college as much as humanly possible. She was living in a dorm like every other freshman, but they'd gone above and beyond to make it feel like home. Nina had everything. A mini fridge, a high-end espresso machine, matching designer decor, even some fancy noise-canceling headphones to help her focus. She never had to think about budgeting or work. Her only responsibility was to enjoy the college experience. Well, not anymore. With $55,000 to repay, Mom and Dad had to tighten the purse strings. Nina's weekly care packages? Gone. The spending money they were planning to send her? Canceled. Even some of the fancy extras in her dorm had to be returned. Suddenly, Nina wasn't just another spoiled golden child. She was a college student like the rest of us. The best part? She had to get a part-time job. I found out through Instagram when Nina posted a selfie in the mirror of some boutique with a caption that read, "First day, working girl life. New adventures." I couldn't help but laugh. She made it sound like a cute little hobby, but I knew her well enough to know she was absolutely miserable. It didn't take long for Nina to crack. One night she called me, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Maya!" she wailed. "Everything's ruined!" I took a deep breath. "What's ruined, Nina?" "My life!" she cried. "Mom and Dad aren't sending me any more money. They said they can't afford it, and now I have to work and budget!" She broke off into another round of sobbing. I rolled my eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Nina, welcome to the real world," I said flatly. "You're finally experiencing what the rest of us deal with every day." She didn't appreciate that response. "This is all your fault!" she snapped, her voice sharp with anger. "If you hadn't told Grandpa, none of this would have happened." That made me laugh. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I ruin your little bubble of privilege? Because as far as I'm concerned, you're just catching up to what I've been dealing with for years." Nina started to say something else, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. "Look," I said, cutting her off. "If you want someone to blame, talk to Mom and Dad. They're the ones who stole from me to fund your perfect little life." She hung up on me, which honestly saved me the trouble of ending the call myself. The weeks that followed were almost entertaining. Nina started posting cryptic updates on social media about how hard life was and how she felt betrayed by the people she trusted most. It was laughable considering she'd spent her entire life being pampered and shielded from reality. Now that she had to face even a fraction of the challenges I'd dealt with, she acted like the world was ending. One post stood out, a picture of her dorm desk with a cup of instant noodles. The caption read, "College life isn't as glamorous as it seems." I stared at it for a while, debating whether to comment. I wanted to say, "You've been living this way for 2 weeks," Try doing it for years. But I stopped myself. What was the point? Nina would never understand. Still, her pity party didn't go unnoticed. Her friends and followers flooded her comments with support, saying things like, "Stay strong, Nina, and you've got this," as if getting a part-time job in budgeting was some insurmountable challenge. From what I heard through the family grapevine, Nina wasn't adjusting well to her new reality. She complained to anyone who would listen about how unfair it all was, but sympathy wasn't as strong as she probably hoped. Most people were too busy with their own problems to care about hers. Mom and Dad tried to soften the blow, of course. They sent her a couple of care packages, nowhere near as extravagant as before, but still enough to remind Nina she was the favorite. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, they told me that struggling was good for me, that it would make me stronger. Now that Nina was struggling, they were bending over backward to make sure she didn't fall apart. But even with their help, Nina wasn't thriving. She was surviving, but that was it. Her grades started slipping, and she had trouble keeping up with her job. The cracks in her perfect facade were starting to show. And honestly, I didn't feel bad for her. Meanwhile, Grandpa didn't just give me a place to stay. He made sure I had everything I needed to get back on track. He helped organize my finances, encouraged me to take a full course load to finish college sooner, and even got me involved in bakery operations. It felt good to be around someone who actually cared about my future. As for my parents, they kept trying to reach out. At first, it was constant. Mom left voicemail after voicemail, her tone switching between guilt trips and apologies. "Maya, we're sorry, okay?" she'd say. "We made mistakes, but we're still your parents. We love you." Sure, they loved me, just not enough to treat me fairly when it mattered. Dad's messages were more subdued, but just as frustrating. "Maya, we know you're upset, but you've got to see it from our side," he'd say. "We were trying to do what was best for the family, and now this family needs you. Please come home." I didn't respond to any of them. What was there to say? They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they'd been caught. They only wanted me back to exploit me one more time. Eventually, the calls slowed down. I think they realized I wasn't going to forgive them just because they wanted me to. Shortly before I officially graduated, Grandpa sat me down in the kitchen. "Maya," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "I've been thinking about the future of the bakery." I opened the folder and found a stack of papers detailing business operations. Grandpa smiled at me, his eyes crinkling the way they always did when he was proud. "You've been helping out a lot," he said, "and I can see how much you care about this place. I want you to take over when you're ready." I stared at him, completely stunned. "Grandpa, are you serious?" "Of course I'm serious," he said. "You've earned this, Maya, and I know you'll make it even better." Hearing that from him meant everything. For so long, I felt like my hard work didn't matter, like no one saw how much I was struggling. But Grandpa did. He always had. Taking over the bakery became my focus after that. I threw myself into learning everything I could about the business, from managing staff to balancing budgets. Grandpa was right there with me, guiding me through every step. By the time I graduated, I was ready to take the reins. Grandpa officially handed over the business, and we celebrated with a big party at the bakery. Friends, staff, even some of my professors showed up to congratulate me. It was the recognition and support I had always wanted, but never received from my parents. These days, I don't talk to my parents much. They're still trying to patch things up, acting like a few apologies will magically fix everything they've done. What they don't realize is that Grandpa already removed them from his will months ago. They're probably still clinging to the hope that they can weasel their way back in. But honestly, it's not my problem. I'm too busy running the bakery and building something real for myself. If they want to waste their time trying to get back into Grandpa's good graces, that's on them. Let them watch from the sidelines. I'm moving forward, and I'm not looking back. The irony of the situation isn't lost on me. My parents forced me to become independent at 18, making me pay my own way through college while supporting my sister completely. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about responsibility, but they never expected that lesson would lead me to become a successful business owner while they're still trying to figure out where it all went wrong. The bakery is thriving under my management. I've modernized some aspects of the operation, added new products to our line, and even expanded our delivery services. Grandpa beams with pride whenever he stops by, which is almost daily. He may have officially retired, but he loves seeing how I've taken his legacy and made it my own. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if my parents had treated me and Nina equally. Would I still have ended up running Grandpa's bakery? Maybe, maybe not. but I do know that their unfair treatment pushed me to become stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more successful than they ever imagined I could be. As for Nina, she eventually adjusted to her new financial reality, though not without plenty of drama along the way. Her Instagram posts gradually shifted from complaints about instant noodles to humble brags about adulting. Last I heard, she's doing okay in school, though nowhere near the stellar performance my parents had always expected from her. Turns out when you actually have to work for things, priorities shift. My parents still reach out occasionally, usually around holidays or birthdays. Their messages always have this hopeful tone, like they're expecting me to suddenly forgive and forget. "We miss you, Maya," they'll say. Or, "Family is family, no matter what." But what they fail to understand is that Grandpa showed me what real family is supposed to be like. Supportive, honest, and unconditionally loving. Grandpa never expected anything in return for helping me. He didn't hold his support over my head or make me feel guilty for needing assistance. He simply gave what he could because he cared about me. That's something my parents never understood. Sometimes I think about the $55,000 they took from me. It's not just about the money. It's about the betrayal, the lies, and the years of unnecessary struggle. I don't know if I'll ever be able to truly forgive them for that. Not when they've shown so little remorse for what they did. But I don't dwell on it much these days. I'm too focused on building my future. The bakery gives me purpose, and I found joy in continuing Grandpa's legacy. I've even started mentoring some of the younger staff, teaching them the tricks Grandpa taught me all those years ago. It feels right, passing on knowledge to people who actually appreciate it. So while my parents are still trying to figure out where it all went wrong, I'm exactly where I need to be. Sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the best outcomes. And in my case, being forced to be independent led me to find real independence. Not the kind my parents tried to force on me, but the kind that comes from building something meaningful on your own terms. I guess in the end, I should thank them for one thing, pushing me away so I could find my own path, even if that wasn't their intention. Their favoritism toward Nina and their cold treatment of me ultimately led me to Grandpa's doorstep and the opportunity of a lifetime. Now I run a successful business while they're left begging for forgiveness. Funny how life works out sometimes, isn't it?